Hi, good evening. Today we'll be going over 40 days in the Psalms, reflection number 6, and we'll go straight into it. We'll go into basically what it is, Psalms 34 and day 26, the Lord's attentive care for the righteous. Here, David is using the testimony of David is pointing out to the tentative care that God has over David, the tentativeness of God's hand over David's life, right? And in this section right here, we can see basically how David is reminding himself that God is basically over his life. But it brings us to a realization again that when God is blessing our lives, it's not only for our sake, but it's also for the sake of encouraging others, and to remind ourselves that God is using us for his glory through his son Jesus Christ, through the Lord Jesus Christ, right? So that's a reminder of that. Psalms 35, day 27, a prayer to the divine warrior. Psalms 35 is a lament, basically, with David expressing his need for God to fight for him against his enemies, right? In this time when David is asking for God's vindication, David requests, again, for the Lord to vindicate him. It's more about it's more about God's reputation rather than it is what David's personal difficulties. So even when David is asking for God's vindication, it's not about David. It's about what God can do and what he's promising to do through his enemies, right? Through the vindication of David. And this is pointing back again towards God again. A prayer to the divine warrior. What is David praying for, right? For God to do his will in his life, in David's life. So again, moving on, Psalms 36, day 28, human wickedness and the divine loving kindness. Psalms 36, again, revisits the certainties of Psalms 1, which is basically contrasting the way of the wicked and the way of the faithful to Yahweh. Again, the way of the wicked is the way of basically that leads far away from God, and the way of the faithful leads to God. Again, in summary, per se, the title, this title of the servant of the Lord is focused here on in Psalms 36, and the servant of the Lord focuses back, right, and to David, of what David is trying to focus on. So David, in this, where David is highlighted as the servant of the Lord, David characterizes these characteristics of the Lord, and he points these out as I'm quoting here. The Lord's faithful love, his faithfulness, his righteousness, and his judgment, right? So David, again, through pointing back on these things, through being the servant of the Lord, David is pointing, and he uses this perspective. He uses his title to point back to God and to say, this is about his love. This is about his faithfulness, right? His righteousness and his judgments. That's what basically Psalms 36 is revolving around, in essence. Psalms 37, day 29 is the instruction in wisdom. Again, Psalms 37 is basically the believer is about the believer having an eternal perspective, by trusting in the Lord and what he's going to do in him by faithfully obeying in the Lord, right? The instruction of wisdom goes back to obedience in God. The wisdom in that perspective is us remaining in the Lord, right? So one of the things that points out to me here is that going back to the book, is how it says that believers remain silently and expectantly should wait on the Lord without complaint, cries, or anguish, or outbursts of anger. To me, that's extremely important because it sticks out to me because of the fact that we wait expectantly. We're waiting here expectantly. And even though there are times of anguish and outbursts and, yes, anger, we wait expectantly, knowing that God is going to help us, that God is that God is with us, and that God is guiding us through these circumstances. And hopefully, through that reminder, we can do and remind ourselves and walk our journey with the Lord without complaints, without cries of anguish or outbursts or anger, right? This is the instruction to wisdom. And we're moving finally to Psalms 38, the day 30, a prayer of confession. This is the last one. So in Psalms 38, David recalls a time in his life when he suffered because of God's displeasure with David's sin. And this is hard because this is David's time where he is suffering, right? It touches upon a theme of divine discipline, suffering, sin, guilt, confession, and hope in God's salvation. And ultimately, David in Psalms 38, it reminds believers that we should not take our sin lightly. So David is reminding us, right? Again, 9 through 11 recognizes that because of his sin, God is disciplining him, and his condition is certainly known by God. So it's not that God doesn't know, and it's not that David doesn't know that he not necessarily deserves this, but the fact that God is just to discipline David, right, says so much more from where we're at. So I think this is an extremely great. This again, I love going over these reflections because it puts into perspective the life of David, what his views are, and also helps me understand, right, as my walk through life, the reflection of how I see as well some of these characteristics of David, and how I should ultimately reflect myself to say, wow, if David did this, I should be able to do this too. Or I should do this. I should put myself in a perspective where sometimes I should not make this, and I say sometimes, but I shouldn't make all my suffering, I shouldn't make all this time of complaints about, man, life is so hard, where is God? But more about what God is going to do and what he is already doing, right? And knowing that even in my sin, God is just. And that should help me focus more on God. So I think this is a great opportunity for us to always confide in the Lord, as David is confiding even in the difficulties, even when he is seeking God's vindication. David is still trusting in the Lord and the direction of where God is going to basically and eventually guide David through. So thank you so much for your time, and I appreciate these videos, and also appreciate just being able to share what these reflections mean to me. Thank you so much.